A while back, I had this great experience where Paul Giamatti and comedian Chris Gethard and I were basically, I think we were in San Francisco, and so we were talking about Mount Shasta. And basically, that's when I learned about the I Am movement, the I Am religion. So this is basically one of the Chinwag episodes. If you get a chance, go back and see, or rather listen to that podcast where Paul and Chris Gethard and I talk about all things sort of bizarre in California. But then I'm walking down the street the other day on my way to meet somebody for sushi, and I'm going underneath the L in Chicago, the elevated tracks, and it's sort of right in that area where the Blues Brothers filmed all those car crashes. And I look up, and as I'm walking by, there is the I Am Church. I thought, you've got to be kidding me. It looked like it had been basically last sort of decorated in the 1970s or 80s. It basically had these big sort of plate glass windows, and then behind there were sort of lit up crosses and blue bejeweled flags, United States flags, and like there was this dude there, like a picture of a dude, and then like a cross, and all this stuff about I am, and then finally you see this kind of plaque that this is basically all about Saint Germain. And some of you who are into the occult and the paranormal will know about Saint Germain. This is an important touchstone to this whole tradition. So today I'm going to talk about the I Am religious movement, which turns out to be a uniquely American kind of spirituality. And it's also this really interesting story because the family who created it gets caught up in this legal battle involving mail fraud, and then it goes to the Supreme Court. Stay tuned, and welcome to Professor Asma's Guide to Unusual Knowledge. To understand the I Am movement, you have to start with Theosophy. This is the esoteric tradition that's basically launched by Helena Blavatsky in the late 19th century. Theosophy introduced the idea of ascended masters, spiritually enlightened beings like El Moira, Khatumi, or Saint Germain, who exist on higher planes but still guide humanity's evolution. It fused Eastern and Western ideas, reincarnation, and mysticism. Basically, it was a kind of secret wisdom, cosmic hierarchy. Blavatsky is involved in a lot of this stuff. She comes from Russia. She has this kind of weird history, which we think basically she made up, in which she goes to Tibet and learns from these ascended masters, brings back the ideas, and then writes all these books. A lot of people gravitate to her and find her ideas interesting because she does bring in and fuse together some Eastern ideas together with Western mystical ideas from the esoteric tradition. In particular, things from the Corpus Hermeticum, Neoplatonic ideas. So she's a very interesting character. I've read some of her stuff, and it's much more interesting than you might imagine. It's not totally wackadoodle, and she had a very sort of mesmerizing personality, so she drew important people to her, but she had a huge and long influence on American esoterica. Blavatsky set up centers all around the world, and one particularly influential in India that then developed, and later sort of proponents of Theosophy were living there in India, were part of the Indian independence movement, and even sort of handpicked a kid who they said was a kind of very important reincarnation or incarnation of an ascended master. His name turned out to be Krishnamurti, and some of you may know the name Krishnamurti because he turned out to be a very interesting spiritual writer in the 20th century after he kind of threw off the Theosophical organization and sort of went his own way. In any case, the Theosophical ideas basically led to all these different fracturing offshoots, of which the I Am Church is one. One of the physical anchor points for these ideas is Mount Shasta in Northern California. Theosophists and later occult authors believe that Shasta was a kind of spiritual beacon, even a kind of a home to hidden spiritual masters, adepts, or even underground Lemurian cities. The Lemurians are fascinating. This is sort of a belief in these giant humanoid creatures that are like a previous race of humanoid. In the American imagination, Shasta became sacred ground. So now enters our main character, Guy W. Ballard. In 1930, while hiking Mount Shasta, Ballard claimed he was approached by the ascended master, Saint Germain. So basically, Ballard is just hiking on a trail. He's just walking along, and here comes some guy, some very interesting looking character, and identifies himself as Saint Germain. So Saint Germain offers Ballard a kind of vision, and it basically opens Ballard's eyes to spiritual truth, a kind of divine mission. Saint Germain, by the way, is a legendary alchemist figure in European lore, and he's a key master in Theosophy. But here he comes along the trail of an American, park on Mount Shasta, and we get this new sort of Americanized version of Saint Germain, intimate and deeply involved in helping the U.S. fulfill its divine role. A lot of this stuff gets picked up by others too, including the great Manly P. Hall, who created the Philosophical Research Society out in Los Angeles, which you can still go to and which I've been to. And I was lucky enough to give a talk there. Those are good people out there. Make sure you visit the Philosophical Research Society. But Manly P. Hall and people like Ballard, they were arguing that the United States, America, had a kind of divine esoteric mission. Believe it or not, these folks had an influence on Ronald Reagan. People think of Reagan as being kind of this fuddy-duddy, conservative, fundamentalist, evangelical, but actually his views were much more informed by some of these kinds of New Age American spiritual movements. There's a long story here. I should do an episode actually on Reagan spiritualism. A lot of people know that he and his wife consulted with psychics, but that's part of an older tradition in his own life in which he came to think of America as having a kind of esoteric divine mission to unify the world, not under the banner necessarily of Christianity, but something broader, a bigger idea about God. So he's kind of more interesting than people imagine. Okay, so Ballard returns to Chicago, where he and his wife Edna begin holding meetings, and they start publishing spiritual texts, and they found this thing called the I Am activity. The movement was formally incorporated in 1932, and today it continues under the Saint Germain Foundation, based in Schaumburg, Illinois. Now, even though they're based in Schaumburg, this church is actually downtown Chicago. I tried to get in there, it was closed, but apparently I can come back to their reading room, but I'm not allowed to sort of go to their services. Apparently I'm just not ascended enough. Okay, so what's their doctrine? Their doctrine is basically centered around the idea of the I Am presence, which is a kind of divine spark or individualized God self within every human being. This is a very old idea. Most mystical traditions have this idea, not that you just speak to God or can relate to God in some way, but something more radical, which is that in some way you are God. At least you have some kind of particle of Godness within you. And so this presence could be contacted and expanded through spiritual discipline. There's also things like meditations like color visualization, and these are ways to kind of, align yourself with the ascended masters. They taught that by affirming things like I am the resurrection and the life, you weren't just praying, you were activating divine power within yourself. Their teachings basically spread pretty quickly. This was a time in the 30s when people were looking for alternatives. The bleak years of the Depression are making people hungry for hope. People need healing, agency. And the Ballards promise not just prosperity and spiritual advancement, but kind of an entire hierarchy of, cosmic benevolence. And this cosmic benevolence was ready to assist humanity. All you had to do was find this I Am presence within yourself. So the Ballards didn't just preach, they performed. In the 1950s and beyond, the I Am activity became known for its massive pageants at Mount Shasta. There was a kind of spiritual theater built there with costumes, orchestras, dramatic reenactments of biblical events, and ascended master messages. These weren't just shows, they were public rituals. In fact, I remember when we were talking, when Giamatti and Gethard and I were talking about this in San Francisco as part of the Chinwag podcast, I remember somebody in the Q&A stood up and said, yeah, my family is still a member of the I Am group, and they still have little organized cabins and housing opportunities there at Mount Shasta, which was pretty eye-opening. That's still there. So at these public rituals, what was happening is they were sort of organizing themselves to do these kind of meditations. They would discuss the ideas. They sort of had like color ray invocations using the violet flame, which they believed could transmute negative karma and purify the soul. And yet, as the movement expanded, so did the scrutiny. So Guy Ballard, who started all this, actually dies in 1939, but his wife and son keep it all going. And in 1942, federal authorities charged Edna and Donald Ballard, that's Guy's son, with mail fraud. Now, here's what happened. The government alleged that the Ballards had knowingly made false claims. They had spoken to ascended masters, is what they said. They received dictations from Saint Germain and possessed divine healing powers. Now, they said all this in these mail flyers that they would send around in order to solicit money and donations through the mail. They were accused of deceiving the public for personal gain. So now a courtroom was asked to decide, is it a crime to believe in the ascended masters? And the trial led to a landmark case, which is the United States versus Ballard, 1944. The key legal dilemma was this: could the government judge the truth of religious claims? The Supreme Court ruled no. In a 5-4 decision, the majority held that courts cannot evaluate the truth or falsity of religious beliefs, only whether the person sincerely holds them. That's a pretty expected outcome, really, if you think about the way the framers set up the Constitution. So that's a direct application of the First Amendment. Religious freedom means you don't have to prove your theology is reasonable in court. Thank God, because that would be the end of most people's theology. Okay. Ultimately, the Ballards were initially convicted in lower court, but the ruling was overturned on appeal. Not because the court endorsed their theology, but because truth of belief couldn't be legally determined. So this case remains foundational in American law. It's actually cited in cases involving televangelists, which, basically that was a huge movement where people make a ton of money by promising miracles and stuff. And, many of us, myself included, think of a lot of this stuff as being fraud, but from a legal point of view, it's kind of in the realm of the acceptable. I guess buyer beware in all things, including the spiritual. So after the legal dust settled, then Edna Ballard continued leading the movement until her death in 1971. Today, the Saint Germain Foundation still operates temples, sanctuaries, and reading rooms globally. They don't recognize any new messengers since the Ballards. The original texts and decrees remain central. Meanwhile, other movements splintered off, most notably the Church Universal and Triumphant, founded by Mark and Elizabeth Clare Prophet in the 1970s. Elizabeth Clare Prophet is pretty famous, I think, and known even beyond sort of the narrow sort of crystal community. All this stuff borrows heavily from IM teachings, especially the Ascended Master cosmology and the kind of ritual practices. The IM activity is sometimes dismissed as a relic of the past, but its ideological DNA runs deep through New Age thought. These kind of thought affirmations, the idea of a kind of law of attraction, is very common in all this stuff. Even sort of, I guess, some of the contemporary megachurch stuff might have its roots in this IM collective new kind of Christianity. So I really love this stuff, the IM church. It really feels uniquely American to me. It blends the wild cosmology of Theosophy with kind of the Protestant work ethic. It dresses up mysticism in these kind of American robes. It transforms the human soul into a kind of executive self, capable of spiritual entrepreneurship. That's really an old message, goes back even to the Puritans. But it also shows the limits of law in the face of belief. When the Ballards said they heard voices from ascended masters, the government said, prove it. And the court said, you don't have to. You only have to believe it. And that question, what is belief and when does it become dangerous or sacred or theatrical or absurd, it still haunts our cultural and legal imagination. All right, thanks for walking with me through the strange light of IM. If you've stood on Mount Shasta, seen Saint Germain on a hiking trail, or felt the IM presence, you've felt a sliver of this American mystery. Until next time, this has been Professor Asma's Guide to Unusual Knowledge, and remember, always stay curious.